Sometimes the loudest words are the ones we never say, and she made every silence between us feel like a confession. The first time I saw her wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks, no sudden collision of fate. Just the quiet, ordinary rhythm of a rainy afternoon, a cafe tucked in a narrow street, steam curling from mismatched mugs. I had been sitting alone, my notebook open, trying to force words onto a page that stubbornly resisted. That's when she walked in. She moved like she belonged to a different world, or maybe she simply carried one within her. Every small gesture felt intentional, yet effortless. The tilt of her head as she scanned the menu, the way her fingers lingered over the spine of a book she carried. She didn't notice me, or maybe she did, but her awareness wasn't intrusive. It was simply there, and somehow, in that presence, the noise around us, chatter, clinking spoons, the hiss of the espresso machine, diminished. I found myself staring, almost embarrassed by how completely my attention had shifted. The gentle sway of her hair as she brushed it behind her ear, the faint scent of something warm and floral that trailed her like a soft whisper, the quiet determination in her steps. Every detail imprinted itself on my mind. I wanted to speak to break the spell, but the words lodged in my throat. They felt too ordinary for someone who made the air feel extraordinary. She found a table by the window, one where the raindrops raced down the glass in lazy, uneven streams. I watched her settle, crossing her legs with a grace that was effortless and natural, like someone who had long ago mastered the art of being present without demanding it. She pulled out a notebook, pen poised in her hand, and for a moment, I thought she might vanish into the lines she wrote, leaving the world behind her. Yet it wasn't just her movements that captivated me. It was the silence she carried. It was not an empty silence, but one rich with thought, layered with hints of something tender and unspoken. I realized that every time our eyes accidentally met, brief, flickering moments, I felt the weight of what wasn't said, heavier than any conversation I had ever had. It made my chest tighten, a quiet ache of curiosity and something else I couldn't name. I didn't approach her that day. I didn't have to. Just watching, just being near her, changed the way I noticed the world. The aroma of coffee seemed sharper, the patter of rain more rhythmic, the quiet hum of life more meaningful. She was a presence that demanded attention not by force, but by the subtle gravity of being entirely herself. When she left, the cafe seemed emptier, the silence heavier. My notebook remained open, but I couldn't write. Not because I didn't want to, but because my mind was still tangled in the memory of the way she moved, the way she breathed, the way she made absence feel louder than any words ever could. I didn't know her name, and yet somehow, I already knew I would see her again. I didn't expect to see her again. And yet, life has a strange way of making certain people unavoidable. The next encounter was not planned, not orchestrated. It felt like the universe quietly nudging us into proximity. I was at the same cafe, my usual corner spot by the window, lost in my thoughts. And there she was, walking in, almost as if she had followed the same pattern of the rain-drenched streets. This time, our paths brushed in the smallest, almost imperceptible ways. Our hands touched briefly while reaching for the same sugar packet, and the warmth of her skin lingered far longer than it should have. I felt the sudden, subtle spark of awareness, a pulse that skipped a beat and left my heart oddly exposed. She smiled, a small, knowing curve of her lips, and the world seemed to pause for a second. Quiet, intimate, and yet charged with a tension that neither of us acknowledged out loud. Later, outside the cafe, we found ourselves walking in the same direction under the drizzle. I offered my umbrella, a small, instinctive gesture that felt both natural and terrifying. Our shoulders brushed, the fabric of our coats pressing together for the briefest moment, and I noticed the soft scent that seemed to follow her everywhere, mingling with the rain. I didn't speak, not really. The silence between us was louder than any words, heavier, carrying a weight I hadn't expected but couldn't ignore. Every glance, every accidental proximity felt layered with unspoken meaning. When she tilted her head to look at something in a shop window, I caught the way her hair fell across her cheek, the subtle tension in her posture. When our eyes met, even briefly, it was like a conversation without sound. Questions asked, answers withheld, emotions hovering in the spaces between. The more time we spent near each other, the more I realized how acutely I felt her presence, and how it unsettled the careful rhythms of my own life. It wasn't just physical closeness, it was a shared awareness, an unspoken acknowledgement of each other's existence. I noticed the way her hands lingered on her coffee cup, the quiet way she shifted her weight when she stood, the almost imperceptible tremor when she laughed softly. Every detail became magnified in my perception. She moved through the world with grace, yet there was a vulnerability, a quiet reserve that pulled me in, demanded my attention. By the time we parted, the umbrella folded between us. I felt a strange emptiness, a tension that tugged at my chest. I wanted to speak, to break the delicate quiet, but the words felt clumsy, intrusive. Instead, I watched her walk away, her figure blurred by the rain, feeling the strange weight of absence again. Somehow, every accidental brush, every proximity that should have been meaningless had left a mark. The silence between us was no longer neutral. It had shape, depth, texture. It was a presence of its own, one that promised that we would meet again, that we were already caught in an orbit neither of us fully understood yet. And I realized, with a mix of anticipation and unease, that the quiet ache she left in me was only just beginning. It wasn't a grand gesture that brought us closer. It was the quiet unraveling of a moment neither of us expected. The rain had slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets glistening under the soft afternoon light. I had been walking aimlessly, still carrying the memory of our brief umbrella encounter, when I spotted her sitting on a bench outside a small bookstore. She looked lost in thought, fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup as if it held the answers to something she wasn't ready to say aloud. I hesitated, but some invisible pull nudged me forward. As I approached, our eyes met, briefly, fleetingly, but there was an unspoken understanding. I didn't sit immediately. I lingered nearby, giving her space, yet the air between us felt charged with expectation. When she finally spoke, it wasn't a question or a greeting. It was a confession of small frustration about the day, a minor disappointment about work, the kind of honesty people usually bury. "I don't know why some days feel heavier than others," she said, voice soft, almost vulnerable, barely above the whisper of the wind through the trees. I didn't offer advice. I just listened, letting the silence wrap around us, letting her words settle in the space between us. She glanced at me, and in that moment, I caught the weight of her emotions, the exhaustion, the quiet longing, the vulnerability she carried beneath a composed exterior. I wanted to reach out, to reassure her, but I waited, giving her control of the moment. Then, almost instinctively, our hands brushed. The contact was light, unassuming, yet it carried a pulse of connection that neither of us could ignore. Her fingers lingered on mine for a heartbeat before she withdrew, slightly, and I noticed the subtle tremor in her hand. It was a small, intimate gesture, but it spoke volumes, the trust she was tentatively extending, the acknowledgement of my presence as a safe place. We didn't speak much after that. Words felt unnecessary. Instead, I watched her, memorizing the quiet way she breathed, the way her hair fell over her shoulders, the subtle curvature of her lips as she forced a small smile. And in the pauses, in the spaces between our glances and gestures, I felt an intimacy grow that had nothing to do with conversation and everything to do with shared understanding. For the first time, I sensed her walls lowering, if only slightly. And in response, I found myself sharing in small ways too, brief confessions about my own doubts, minor fears, the kind of things that normally stayed tucked away. We were strangers who had somehow begun to exist in the same fragile bubble, a place where silence didn't feel empty but full of quiet honesty and empathy. When we finally parted, it was with a lingering gaze, a mutual hesitation to step back into the ordinary flow of life. I walked away feeling a strange lightness mixed with the ache of longing, the understanding that we had just crossed an invisible threshold, that something profound had shifted in the quiet between us. It was in that shared vulnerability, brief and fleeting, that I realized how dangerous it could be to feel this strongly about someone without even a word of declaration. Yet somehow, it was intoxicating, compelling, and entirely impossible to ignore. The days that followed were filled with a quiet rhythm, a gentle repetition of small encounters that felt almost accidental but were impossible to ignore. Each meeting carried a delicate tension, like the thin line between curiosity and desire, and slowly, our interactions began to take on a playful, teasing quality. It started with a shared coffee at the corner cafe. I arrived first and claimed our usual table by the window. When she walked in, her eyes found mine instantly, and the faint curve of her lips suggested she had noticed my small act of territoriality. "I see you're holding my spot hostage again," she said lightly, and there was a spark in her voice, a tease that immediately put my heart on edge. I grinned, a little embarrassed but also delighted. "I thought you might like the view," I replied, nodding toward the rain-streaked streets outside, but the truth was, I liked the view of her more. Our conversation was a delicate dance, full of subtle jabs and gentle challenges. I would comment on her choice of book or her quiet observational habits, and she would shoot back with a witty remark, her voice laced with laughter that seemed to hang in the air long after it left her lips. The teasing was never cruel, never dismissive. It was a way of drawing closer, a method of testing the boundaries of familiarity without crossing them. And then there were the touches, small, almost accidental, yet electric in their simplicity. A hand brushing hers as we reached for the same sugar packet, a gentle nudge of her elbow when I teased her too sharply, the briefest graze of her fingers against my arm when she handed me a notebook. Each touch was a spark, a quiet message of connection, more meaningful than any declaration could have been. I noticed how her presence seemed to linger even after she left. The scent of her perfume, soft and warm, clung to the air around her. The memory of her laughter echoed in my mind, and even the briefest glance at her face could set my thoughts adrift. And yet, there was restraint, an unspoken agreement that our growing attachment would unfold slowly, naturally, without rush or demand. There were moments of shared silence, too, sitting across from each other in the cafe or walking side by side under a light drizzle. In those silences, we communicated in ways that words could never capture. A tilt of her head, the way she lingered just a fraction longer when passing me, the soft exhale as she laughed at something I said. These were the small intimacies that tethered us together more than any overt confession could. By the end of the day, the playfulness had transformed into warmth. I felt a deepening attachment that was both thrilling and terrifying. Each joke, each small touch, each lingering glance was a thread weaving us closer, binding our silences into something meaningful, something impossible to ignore. And through it all, the quiet tension between us remained, a gentle pull that neither of us fully understood but both were drawn to, a subtle promise that there was more to come, more to discover, and more to feel. The air between us had grown heavier, charged with an unspoken awareness that neither of us fully acknowledged. It was a quiet evening, the kind where the world seems to hold its breath, and we found ourselves in the same small, secluded corner of the park. A soft lamp illuminated the wooden bench where we sat side by side, the golden glow reflecting faintly in her eyes. She seemed quieter than usual, thoughtful, almost fragile in her stillness. I had been careful to give her space, but something in her posture, slightly hunched shoulders, fingers tracing the edge of the bench, made me lean a fraction closer. She noticed, of course. I could feel her gaze flicker toward me, tentative, searching, as if asking permission without words. I swallowed hard, aware that whatever I said, or didn't say, would shift something fundamental between us. Then she spoke, her voice low and deliberate. Sometimes I wonder if anyone really notices the small parts of us, the ones we hide, even from ourselves. Her words were simple, but they carried weight, a vulnerability that made my chest tighten. I wanted to reach for her hand, to reassure her, but the hesitation held me back. Instead, I listened, letting the silence stretch, heavy and intimate. I could feel my own emotions teetering on the edge. I wanted to tell her how her presence had been haunting my thoughts, how her laughter lingered in my mind long after she left, how the briefest touches, her fingers brushing mine, a shoulder against mine, had left me aware of a connection I couldn't ignore. But fear held my tongue. The age difference, the uncertainty, the potential for misunderstanding, they all crowded my mind, whispering reasons to stay silent. She noticed my hesitation, I think, though she didn't press. Instead, she let her hand hover near mine, the warmth of her fingers brushing against the back of my hand for a heartbeat before retreating. That single, fleeting contact sent a ripple through me, a mix of longing and restraint, proof that our emotions were already intertwined even without a declaration. The silence that followed was louder than any conversation could have been. It carried the weight of all the things we were afraid to say, the attraction, the curiosity, the growing care. Her gaze found mine again, steady and vulnerable, and I felt the tension of unspoken desire pressing gently against the boundaries of propriety. Every small gesture, the tilt of her head, the soft exhale of breath, the subtle shift of her shoulder, spoke volumes. Finally, I whispered the smallest acknowledgement of my feelings, careful, tentative, almost swallowed by the night. She didn't respond immediately, but her fingers lingered near mine a moment longer, her lips curving into a quiet, knowing smile. That tiny acknowledgement was enough. Enough to promise that the silence between us was no longer empty. Enough to let us feel, without words, that something profound was beginning to bloom. As we parted that evening, I walked away with the ache of longing pressing against a fragile hope. The tension had grown, yes, but it had also deepened our bond. And I knew, with a certainty that surprised me, that our connection, the silences, the touches, the hesitant confessions, was only just beginning. After that evening in the park, everything changed, though nothing had outwardly shifted. We began to exist in each other's presence differently, less tentative, more attuned. The tension remained, yes, but it had softened into something warm, a quiet undercurrent of mutual understanding and comfort. It was in the small, seemingly inconsequential moments that our connection grew deepest. One afternoon, we found ourselves walking together through a narrow street lined with autumn trees, the leaves crunching softly underfoot. The sun filtered through the branches, scattering gold and amber across the cobblestones. I noticed how her scarf caught the light, how it framed her face in a way that made her expression almost impossibly soft, almost vulnerable. She walked slightly ahead, and I fell in a step behind her, careful to match her pace, careful not to crowd, yet relishing the simple closeness of our shoulders brushing as we passed. We stopped at a small market, drawn to the scent of fresh bread and roasting coffee. She picked up a loaf, turning it in her hands as she glanced at me with a question in her eyes. I reached out, guiding the bag gently, and for the briefest moment, our hands touched, palm to palm, the warmth of her skin grounding me. The contact was fleeting, unspoken, but it carried a comfort, a reassurance, a sense that in these small gestures, we were learning each other's language of trust. Later, we sat on a low wall overlooking a quiet canal. The water rippled softly in the afternoon light, and the air smelled faintly of damp earth and fallen leaves. She leaned back slightly, her shoulder brushing mine, and I felt the ease of her presence settle into me. Our conversation drifted from trivial observations to stories of our childhoods, our fears, our little regrets. There were pauses, long stretches where we simply existed side by side, and in those pauses, the world shrank to the warmth of our shared space. She brushed a stray strand of hair from her face, and the movement was slow, intimate, as if allowing me to notice her without demanding attention. My hand hovered near hers, almost touching, and I felt a thrill that was neither loud nor dramatic. Simply the recognition that we were slowly, steadily, creating a quiet intimacy that had nothing to do with words. Our silences no longer felt loaded with tension. They were comforting, like the calm after a storm, filled with an unspoken promise of mutual care. By the time we parted, the air between us felt lighter, yet deeper, as though we had crossed a threshold together. The hesitations that had once defined us were melting into a gentle acceptance of ourselves, of each other, and of the slow, deliberate unfolding of our connection. Every glance, every brush of skin, every shared silence had become a form of communication, a way of saying, without saying, that we were here, present, and attuned to each other's hearts. For the first time, I understood that intimacy didn't always require words or declarations. It was in the rhythm of proximity, in the warmth of a touch, in the patient observation of each other. And in that quiet, I felt something profound, the slow, steady bloom of trust, affection, and a connection that promised more than either of us had expected. The final moments of our story didn't arrive with fanfare. They came quietly, naturally, as though the universe had been patiently arranging everything just right. We were back at the same cafe where it had all begun, the one corner by the window that had witnessed our first silent glances and lingering touches. Outside, the rain had returned in a gentle drizzle, tapping against the glass with a rhythm that somehow mirrored the slow beat of my heart. She arrived first, notebook in hand, and I followed moments later, carrying a small bouquet of wildflowers I had picked along the way. She looked up when I entered, and for a heartbeat, everything else dissolved, the chatter, the coffee machines, the people passing by. Her eyes met mine, and in them, I saw the reflection of every unspoken word, every fleeting touch, every pause where the silence between us had carried more meaning than language ever could. We sat side by side, and this time, the silence felt full, comforting rather than uncertain. I offered her the flowers, and when her fingers brushed mine while taking them, a warmth spread through me that was both grounding and exhilarating. She smiled softly, eyes glinting with a mixture of amusement and something deeper, something tender that had been growing for weeks without either of us having the courage to name it. Our conversation was light, yet every word carried weight, layers of familiarity, understanding, and mutual care. When she laughed, the sound was softer than before, but it reached into me, dissolving every lingering hesitation. I noticed the way her shoulder leaned against mine, subtly, naturally, as though testing the comfort closeness, and I responded by letting my hand brush hers, deliberately this time, lingering just a little longer. The moment of fulfillment came not with a grand declaration, but with the quiet intimacy we had cultivated all along. Our hands found each other and intertwined with ease, fingers fitting together as if they had always been meant to. She leaned her head lightly against my shoulder, and I felt the steady rhythm of her heartbeat, the softness of her breath, the gentle warmth of her presence. Words were unnecessary. The silence between us had transformed into something infinitely more powerful: trust, affection, and an unspoken promise of togetherness. I brushed a loose strand of hair from her face, and our eyes met again, lingering in a gaze that conveyed everything our words had not. A soft exhale, a subtle shift closer, and finally a gentle kiss on the cheek, a gesture that held all the tenderness, desire, and respect we had built over time. There was no urgency, no drama, only the quiet affirmation that we were exactly where we were meant to be, together in a moment, fully present, fully known. As we left the cafe, side by side, walking slowly under the drizzle, I realized that the silence that had once been charged with tension had now become a language of its own, a language of comfort, understanding, and quiet love. Each brush of a hand, each shared glance, each moment of stillness spoke more profoundly than words ever could. In the end, it was simple yet complete. The slow burn of curiosity, longing, hesitation, and tenderness had blossomed into an intimacy that was as natural as it was inevitable. And as we continued down the rain-slicked street, the warmth of her presence beside me, I knew, without a doubt, that the story we had written together in silence was far more powerful than anything spoken aloud.